Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas politics and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's show, I'm going to tackle the question, just how close is Texas to leaving the Union? I'm going to explore the strength of support for Texas leaving the Union, some of the key areas where Texas separation from the Union has already begun, and some events that could touch off that final break with the federal government. So don't go anywhere. Well, so glad you could join us for this episode of the Texas News Podcast. We're going to tackle today really and truly what I believe is a pretty important question. And I've often been surprised at how people really don't understand how close Texas is to being a self-governing independent nation. We in my book, Texit, Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union, I tried to address some of that. But today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the things that the vast majority of people just don't realize about where Texas is, what Texas has done to, I guess you could essentially say, separate itself, to assert its independence. But it's not enough to just really talk about those parts of it. I think it's also really, really important to talk about what could push Texas. What could we see that would push Texas to jump over that gap? So before we begin, though, I think we really need to understand and set the terms of the discussion today. Because what we're talking about, when we're talking about Texas leaving the Union, or we're talking about separation, we're talking about a process where Texas ends up becoming a self-governing independent nation. Now, if you listen to last week's podcast, which I would suggest you go do, there was a discussion about several of these international trips that Abbott has been taking and meeting with representatives from governments in the UK, France, on and on. I'm not going to recap all of that. But what I did was I put it in the context of the Montevideo Convention, okay, which is this international convention that essentially laid out a four-part criteria for what defines a state. Okay, so it's used sort of through an international lens to say, this is what we consider a state, which is a term with a very finite definition. And this over here is not. And not saying that one is better than the other one, although being defined as a state under Montevideo is extremely helpful on the path to independence. But just utilizing that criteria, that four-part test, is really what we're looking for. And we could already say, as I asserted during last week's podcast, that Texas already meets all four criteria, right? I mean, we're already there. And the speculation from last week was that Abbott's international trips meet the fourth criteria and therefore fill it all out so that Texas is a state by international law definition. Okay. Now, I'm not going to rehash all of that, but I did want to set up today to understand that when we're talking about Texas separating from the Union, Texas becoming an independent nation, that what we're going to do today is examine it through that lens. And we're going to look at what Texas already has, what Texas is doing, and we're moving toward that final definition where Texas is politically and economically independent. And it's important for all of us to understand that Texit is a process. And because it is a process, we have to, we have to know what our starting point is. We got to know what our ending point is, and we got to know where we are on that path to get there. And as I said at the very beginning, people, I think, are really shocked when they put all these things together and they realize that Texas is so much closer to withdrawing from the Union than they ever anticipated. There are, I think, and a lot of it gets down to no one really just sits down and thinks about this aspect of it. They don't put the pieces together. And so, it's going to be an interesting one today, because it's going to be packed with an awful lot of discussion about where Texas is in this process. So, look, but before we talk about how close Texas actually is, and things that are happening, that political and economic separation, I think it's important to understand where support for Texit is, because it's not just about the structural things, some of the legislative action, but where is support for just outright withdrawing from the union? Well, look, I think it bears a recap, right? We know right now that a vote on Texas is the official position of the dominant political party in the state of Texas. The Republican Party of Texas has two planks in its current platform, Plank 33 and Plank 225, that call for the legislature to put the Texas question to a vote of the people, right? And this wasn't a new development. This wasn't in their most recent one. This was officially put in a single plank 2 years prior. So we know that from a political standpoint, it's not this third rail. At least a Texit vote is not a third rail that you can no longer touch. Now, you couldn't say that many years ago, right? But where we are right now is a Texit vote is the official position of the dominant political party in Texas. In addition to that, back in 2022, you had the release of a poll from Survey USA, something that I've mentioned on this podcast plenty of times. The information about it is actually on the TNM news site. There are plenty of articles over there that you could search for and find it. But it was effectively, for I think a lot of people, a bombshell. In the summer of 2022, right around the time that news broke about the two planks being added to the Republican Party platform, Survey USA released this. As I said, I mean, it was a political bomb, a polling bomb, where they surveyed several states, Texas included, and they surveyed those states individually, not as some of these other fake pollsters do and try to group them as regions, or survey secession sentiment in all the states. Just and they survey 800 people across all 50 states, and this is what they say. I mean, that's just stupid, right? But this Survey USA poll is quite interesting because they took it state by state. And in Texas, what they found was support for Texas becoming an independent nation was at 60% of overall voters and 66% of likely voters. Now, that's earth-shattering. It's major. And especially when you realize that Survey USA is consistently ranked one of the most accurate polling companies by 538, which again is sort of this aggregation of polling. I think they're owned by ABC News now or whatever. So, but what they do is they track outcomes, and they say that Survey USA is ranked typically 1, 2, or 3, somewhere in that ballpark of most accurate polling companies. And so that's got a lot of weight to it. And while we've had subsequent polls that have shown less support than the Survey USA poll, it is still significant, with well over a third of support being shown in the poll that was commissioned by Redfield Strategies from Newsweek, as well as a YouGov poll. And while those two polls may have had some accuracy and methodology issues, we talked to the world's leading expert on independence referendums, and he says that even with those numbers, Texas is well ahead of the curve. Here's what he had to say.
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't know if it's an outlier or not, because I haven't seen any of the polling. That's relatively new. I think what I take from this, and this is where I sort of wanted to be, beef myself up as referendum expert, sort of all around the subject, is that generally in referendums, you need to have a cushion of 10% to win them, because in most referendums, you start sort of losing support as you go along. What is interesting about independence referendum is independence referendum tends to work in a different way. People, they what my colleague Laurence Leduc in Canada has called an uphill struggle. So people start from behind and then they move up. What is interesting about this one is that if you look at 2010, so 4 years before the Scottish independence referendum, the support for Scottish independence were actually lower than it is in Texas now. So Texas is actually ahead of the curve if we compare it to Scotland.
Now, in addition to the support from the people, you're beginning to see an outcropping of that. You're beginning to see that really enter into the political sphere, right? It's one thing to have polling. It's another thing to have it on a party platform. But now what we're seeing is a significant number of candidates that ran for office in the Texas legislature in this cycle won their primaries in March after signing a pledge to file legislation giving Texans a vote on Texit. So again, it is further proof that support for Texit is riding high in the sense that it is no longer that political third rail, as evidenced by the fact that candidates were willing to sign a pledge that they would file legislation to give Texans a vote on this issue. If it were, as the opposition says, oftentimes political poison, they wouldn't have come within 10 feet of signing that pledge, but they did. And not only did they ran for office. As I talked about on a previous podcast, it is very clear that those candidates that signed the pledge and were attacked for signing the pledge by the incumbents outperformed those that did not sign the pledge. They came out, even when they entered into runoffs, they ended up as the top vote getter with one exception. So, we know that support is riding high. Not only this, you're seeing it in the media all the time, right? Every other day, it seems, Newsweek, a world-renowned publication, is writing about Texit. We're seeing it appear in op-eds, either for or against. We're seeing, this issue, particularly with its nexus to the border, appearing on Fox News. I mean, my email notifications for Texit or secession or Texas nationalist movement mentions is going off multiple times a day, every single solitary day. So we know that support is there. And not just support for a vote, but support for Texas. And I think that is one of the prerequisites. If we're going to examine how close Texas is to leaving the Union, the one thing you've got to determine right out of the gate is there any support for it whatsoever? And I think it is abundantly clear. But beyond that, I think it's important for us to really look at the fact that political and economic separation is already happening. Okay, now, you can look at this two ways. You can look at it from the sense, is Texas structurally prepared to be a self-governing independent nation? But then you can look at that and say, look, if there are any gaps, what is Texas doing to assert its independence short of this Texit vote that we're talking about? And I think what you will find is quite interesting is that the separation began a long time ago, because the gap was not nearly as wide as many people think. One of the common slurs against Texas, one of the common opposition arguments is that Texas could never make it as an independent nation. We don't have what it takes. And they do that, and they're not even joking about it when they say it. They look at us. We're the eighth largest economy. We've heard preliminary reports will say that we will probably jump to the seventh largest by Q4 of this year. And beyond that, we're set up economically in ways that most already self-governing independent nations, if you want to call them that, would be jealous of. And the vast majority of that is not because of our relationship with the federal government, but in spite of our relationship with the federal government. But I think it's important to look. Let's just look structurally at where we are. Texas has its own constitution, right? The Texas Constitution of 1876, a very weighty document, but it exists with its own Bill of Rights. And so we have a governing document. We have a rule of law and all of the statutes that come from that. We have an executive branch with a governor and a lieutenant governor. We have a bicameral legislature with a House and a Senate. We have a Supreme Court, and technically we have two of them, one that deals exclusively with criminal matters and one that deals exclusively with civil matters, right? So structurally speaking, at a fundamental level, governing document, structured government, guys, that's literally, if you look around the world, that's what countries have. I mean, it may be structured differently, but they have a functioning government. Go back to that Montevideo Convention, right? But we have those things. And I'll tell you this, and I know for some of you, you think, well, of course we have a constitution, but you would be surprised at how many people I talk to that don't realize that Texas has its own constitution. And those are the same people that are surprised to learn that every state has its own constitution, right? But it's important, right? It's important to start there and understand where it is. Now, diving deeper, if you want to look structurally, it's pretty clear. To me, it has been for many years, but typically not for everyone. They're like, how are you going to exist? How could you exist without all the things the federal government does? But these are the same people who don't realize that there is a very clear and direct state level analog for every federal cabinet level department, right? So, like on the federal level, you have the Department of State. On the Texas side, you have the Texas Secretary of State. You have a Department of the Treasury on the federal side. On the Texas side, you have a Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. You know, they have a Department of Defense. We have the Texas Military Department, which has been in the headlines over the border issue over and over. They have a Department of Justice. We have the Office of the Attorney General. They have a Department of the Interior. We have Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, and the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality. They have a Department of Agriculture. We have the Texas Department of Agriculture. They have a Department of Commerce. We have a Texas Economic Development and Tourism Office. They have a Department of Labor. We have Texas Workforce Commission. I mean, it goes on and on and on for every single federal level cabinet position or department. There is at least one clear analog at the state level, and it may be structured a bit differently. For example, they have a Department of Energy, and ours is actually split between the Texas Railroad Commission and the Texas Public Utilities Commission, right? Or they have a Department of Education, which is something people say the federal government should abolish. But we have an elected state board of education, and we have the Texas Education Agency. And they both have very distinct and discrete functions. And interestingly enough, our state board of education, as I said, are elected, as opposed to this executive level thing on the federal government called the Department of Education that, frankly, probably should not even exist. Well, it definitely shouldn't exist. But it is also very clear that when you compare what you have on the federal side and the Texas side, it's not that we just have a clear analog, it's that they even do better. Right? So structurally speaking, and you know, because we don't have all day to go through this, but I think structurally speaking, it's important to understand that Texas is already structured like an independent nation. Right? So if tomorrow the snap of the fingers happened and we were independent, that's not how it's going to happen, but if we were independent tomorrow, structurally and functionally, we are like an independent, self-governing nation. And we can handle our own. But I think it's important to understand also that where some of these gaps lie. And granted, when we talk about this, we could go back and talk about, well, look, the Texas Military Department is not a full-blown military. You know, our Secretary of State here in Texas doesn't have the ability, you know, doesn't have really a foreign affairs function, right? We can talk about those gaps. But they're not significant gaps, right? And one of the gaps that I think it's important to understand that Texas is definitely moving forward on, obviously, is the Texas Military Department. It has been the position of the TNM for well over a decade now that the Texas State Guard should be fully militarized. And there have been, because of the border situation, there's been more discussion about that. I suspect we probably will see legislative action on that in the next session, right? To help close that gap. But I think there are really three major areas. If you want to see how close Texas is to leaving the union, and the movement that it's making to close those gaps, I think there are really three key areas which shock most people. The first is in currency and banking, and then, of course, international agreements, which we talked about last week, and that in border protection. And while this is not the sum total of all of the movement that Texas is making, I think it does give a clear indication. You see, most people don't realize that back in 2015, Governor Greg Abbott signed the Texas Bullion Depository Bill, or it's often called the Texas Gold Depository Bill, because that was how it was actually known when they tried to pass it a couple of sessions before that. But it was HB 483, and the Texas Bullion Depository Bill essentially established for Texas its own Fort Knox, a state-owned precious metals storage facility that is exempt from confiscation, where by law the state says, look, we're not going to allow the federal government to come in and confiscate precious metals in this depository. And it was important as a show of sovereignty initially to say, look, we don't need to store any of the gold owned by the state of Texas at HSBC Bank in New York. Let's repatriate our gold to Texas, our precious metals, our investments. And most of that was tied to one or more of the sovereign wealth funds that are owned by Texas. Okay, now you will hear wonkish economists talk about how every self-governing independent nation has its own sovereign wealth fund. That's essentially what it was. It was a part of an investment portfolio for one of the sovereign wealth funds that Texas has, and that's you have the permanent university fund, the permanent school fund. It goes on and on. That's a whole other podcast episode for the more wonkish amongst us. But it was important from a sovereignty perspective to repatriate that gold to Texas. But the more important, there were really two important things that were done in relation to that piece of legislation. And the first one is that it created this depository. It didn't just say, look, move the gold here, store it in a bank. It moved the gold here in our own precious metals depository and opened that depository up for people that own precious metals to also use that as a depository, so they didn't have to store it in their houses. So that was number one, a publicly owned precious metal depository, generally tied to sovereign wealth funds, that was protected by the state. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that it called for the creation of an electronic system of transaction denominated by deposits of precious metals in the depository. Well, interestingly enough, if you cut through all of that legalese, what it essentially did was call on the comptroller to create an electronic transfer system, basically an electronic currency based off of the precious metals, a way that you and I could transact. If I had precious metals in there and you had precious metals in there, it would be a system for us to transact that without having to go and get the physical gold and, you get yours and you give it to me and I give you cash, or vice versa. It allowed the exchange of those precious metals electronically. At least it called for it. And although it never got done, the movement has been happening to force that into being. In fact, if you go to the last legislative session in the 88th legislature, one of the things that really went under the radar because of all of the other drama that happened during the legislative session was a series of bills. I'm going to cover one of them, but understand that they all dealt around some of the same subject matter. But Senate Bill 2334 was related to the establishment of a digital currency backed by gold. Essentially, what it was setting out to do was extend what was done in HB 483, the Texas Bullion Depository Bill, extend it out and effectively create a digital, stable currency backed by gold. Right? So instead of being governed by the flick of the switch of the printing press, it essentially would be backed and exchangeable by assets that were stored in the Texas Bullion Depository. So this was major, and how more I guess how it didn't get more attention is beyond me. But maybe it's because that people don't see its impact and where this is headed. You see, currency, uh, currency is one of those things that self-governing independent nations typically want to have. It's at the top of the list, and there is this prevailing sense that the federal government is driving the economy, and particularly the monetary system, into the ground. With some people even talking about the high potential for an economic or monetary collapse based off of the federal debt. I mean, there's a ton of reasons, right? But this is a concrete step for Texas to literally refer to it as a currency. Because at the moment that they refer to it as a currency, that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about where this is headed. Because if you snip that tie and Texas has a digital currency, that's a major signal for where this is headed. So, look, in short, if you have a sovereign wealth fund, you have a state owned equivalent of Fort Knox, and you've got a digital mechanism to trade the precious metals that are on deposit there, you're literally one short step away from laying a currency on top of that system, right? So it's an amazing thing. We don't have a currency, but let's be honest, it's not 100% necessary. But the fact that Texas is taking concrete actions to implement its own currency should tell you that Texas is closer to leaving the Union than most people realize. And so you do these things with this, the sovereign wealth fund and the depository and everything else, and you look at that in the context of the existing state chartered banking system, which most people don't realize we have more state chartered banks in Texas than we have federally chartered banks in Texas. You take that into the context of this currency play, and what you have looks a whole lot like an independent nation, or at least someone, or a state, or self-governing independent, whatever you want to call it, a group, a state. It definitely looks like a state that's making the move to separate itself. And understand that these are not these are not long plays. These are not, what we're talking about here is not 10 or 20-year plays. I mean, these are things that are happening. There's nothing literally preventing Governor Abbott from calling a special session and putting this on the call. In fact, there was discussion during the 4 special sessions that were called this go around that this was going to make one of the calls, the revival of SB 2334. So understand that when it comes to the currency and banking issue, the gap is about a hair's breadth wide, and it's not impossible for us to jump over it in a matter of 30 to 60 to 90 days. That's just the way that it is. But then you've got to look at the international agreements. Now, it's something that I covered a lot on the last podcast. I've already mentioned it a couple times on this one. But the ability for Texas to go out there and engage in these international agreements. Now, some people will say these are photo ops, right? These are feel-good things. But let's look at it. Greg Abbott has made these trips to the UK. There have been discussions with France and agreements with Finland, and the list goes on. I'm not going to repeat the list from last time, but understand that those foreign trips and those agreements are, and particularly at the velocity that they're happening right now, are not usual for countries that are for states of the United States. It's just not a normal thing to see so much of that happening in such a short time frame. But it's not about that, because I don't want to deal with the economic aspects of it. But it's important to know that while these have been economic in scope, the bottom line is, if you can hammer out a statement of mutual cooperation, how hard is it to hammer out an actual treaty? And that would include trade agreements, travel agreements, mutual defense pacts, and much more. But it also means that if you can execute these, that you are perfectly capable of signing on to international multilateral covenants and conventions. In other words, it's not so much the context of it, but that the activity is happening and how little it would take to flip that switch over uh, if Texas made the decision to do so. If Texans went to the polls and vote, you flip that switch. And now all of a sudden, these are not economic development missions, these are diplomatic missions. So again, much like the currency and the banking issue, the gap between where we are and where we need to be separated from the union is about a hair's breadth wide. Now, the final area that I think it's important to look at is in border protection. Now, we've covered the border issues extensively on this podcast. They are all in the news. And in fact, there was a Fox News article that hit just over the weekend that dealt with that we got to talk about. There was an interview with me where I got to talk about the border issues that are happening. But understand, and so I'm saying that to say that I'm not going to cover it in a deep dive, but I do want to give it a mention because it's clear that Texas has recently shown its willingness to protect its own borders and engage in its own immigration enforcement outside of what the federal government says we can and cannot do. If the federal government is failing to do it, Texas is stepping up and fulfilling that role or responsibility and basically saying to the federal government, pound sand. And so, with Texas taking these steps for border protection to go and directly address border protection and immigration, if it can do it in this context at this level with the federal government dragging its feet and our elected officials still being a bit apprehensive about, really going toe to toe with the federal government over this issue, it is just again a short step for Texas to flip that switch and take care of border protection and immigration on our own. So it's again, when you look at this political and economic separation, it is already happening across a whole host of issues. When you have the current attorney general and the governor who was once attorney general essentially bragging that what they do is they get up in the morning, they sue the federal government, and then they go back to bed, and that happens to be their day. It's very clear that across many metrics, Texas is already asserting its influence, asserting its independence, and moving us ever closer to being an independent, self-governing nation, to having this separation from the federal government. But the question here is, and we get it all the time, what is it? What could be the thing that takes it all the way to the finish line? In other words, look, you've looked at this thing structurally. You understand that Texas is making moves across a whole spectrum of issues to close those gaps that effectively make Texas de facto independent. But what could precipitate the jump across that gap to take it from, yeah, we're moving this direction to, no, we're there and we don't need the federal government anymore. Now, and I want to talk about this in the context not just of the Texit vote, right? We understand that the Texit vote does that, but I want you to understand sort of the much larger picture of what will push Texas over that tipping point. And it's important to look at really the two factors of this. On one side, there are internal pressures, right? There are political pressures and economic pressures within Texas that push Texas closer to independence. And then there are the external pressures, these external forces, these things that could happen that are outside of our control that would effectively flip that switch and make Texit happen almost immediately to accelerate that. You see, the Texit timeline accelerates when Texit becomes the primary driver in Texas politics, right? This is internal that I'm talking about here. So when you see the Texit issue become the prime mover, in other words, it becomes the kingmaker, or the one that everyone wants to rally around or against, right? If they're rallying for it or railing against it, either way, if it becomes a major issue in Texas politics, then understand that timeline accelerates, and that's what I would call the internal pressures. Look, already talked about the level of support that it has. So understand that for us to get that the rest of the way, that all you have to do is kind of turn that dial up a bit. You have to convert that support into actual organized political muscle, right? And so, when essentially what you're looking at is when the pro-Texit voting bloc becomes large enough to influence campaigns and the outcome of elections, you're at that tipping point for Texit to happen, for it to go all the way. And I will tell you, there is an argument to be made that we are there. Uh, as I stated previously, we have support from the voters, right? If you look at the polling, even with the bad polling, it's obvious we're on a trajectory to get there. But let me just put it in real terms so you understand, right? So the Texas Nationalist Movement, as an organized voting bloc, is well over 620,000 strong, at least when I looked at the number right before I got on. I mean, maybe we had a big surge while I was walking up the stairs to this microphone. I don't know. But as of this, we were well over 620,000 strong, right? And if you look at that as an organized voting bloc, if Texit is the primary issue for that voting bloc, that becomes a number you can work with. And you can begin to look and see if those internal pressures are building to the point that Texit is an inevitability. So let me just throw this at you. So you look in the recent primaries on March 5th, the 2024 Republican primaries. This is obviously a ballot that the office of president was on. And you had 2.3 million votes cast for president, which is a sizable number in the Republican primaries. Now, before anyone complains, understand that I'm looking at the primaries first. I'll get to the general election in a minute, okay? So if you look at 2.3 million votes cast for president in the 2024 Republican primaries, and you were to assume that the TNM votes as a block, okay, then what that means is the pro-Texit side potentially controls about 26.9% of the votes in a party's primary, right? And I say potentially because the assumption is that the supporters from the TNM are going to vote as a block, and you never have 100%, right? You're never going to get there. But the fact of the matter is if they did vote as a block, at least a sizable number of them, then what you're looking at is the ability for the pro-Texit side to control just shy under 27% of votes in a party's primary, which is where most of the legislative and down ballot races are decided. Because of gerrymandering, typically who wins in a party's primary is the person who goes on to fill that legislative seat because of how the districts are drawn. Now, what does that do? It means that if the TNM were to grow from 620,000 to 1.2 million, just not even quite doubling the number where it is now, it means that it could effectively control all of the legislative election outcomes in one party and nominate pro-Texit candidates for all statewide offices at will. I mean, let's be honest, 27% can influence the outcome of elections, and that's where we are right now. We know that the pro-Texit side can influence these party primaries one way or the other. But if you want to run the table, you take that number from 600,000 up to 1.2 million, and that's how you do it. That's how you run the table. It essentially means that whatever the pro-Texit side wants in legislative races, it gets. And it also means that because you control the outcomes of those primaries, what that does for you is it says, okay, it's only going to be pro-Texit nominees for statewide offices as well. So that's the magic number. Now, And if you only want to see how that plays out into the general election, you only need to look at the last gubernatorial election in 2022 to see that a voting bloc of this size could play a major role in the general elections, right? Because we're looking at state level offices here, and it's important to do so. But understand that in the 2022 election, in the general election, Abbott won re-election only by a 10, almost 11-point margin, okay? So that amounts really to, he won by 891,000 votes, which in Texas terms is not extraordinary. It's not a lot. And so if you give the same conditions before of the TNM voting or not voting as a block, it would only need to acquire the support of 271,000 more Texas voters to force Texit to become a major issue in a hotly contested general election. Okay? What that effectively means is you have enough voting as a block to control the outcome. And so, with the number of TNM supporters growing daily and more legislators that support a vote on Texas than ever before heading into the next session, it looks like those internal pressures are at a tipping point. And the fact of the matter is, while it goes under the radar for a lot of people, there is one group of people that have noticed it and are making their observations known, and that is the media. We're seeing this major impact where you have people inside of mainstream media who have contorted themselves into pretzels previously to not cover this, to absolutely start sounding the alarm that Texit is going to happen. That's both domestic and international. I talked extensively on a previous podcast about how the Dallas Morning News sounded this massive alarm that a bunch of candidates signed our Texas First Pledge, right? We received the cover of Newsweek. I mentioned Newsweek earlier. Every other day, I mentioned the Fox News story that was released over the weekend. These are not aberrations. Understand that we have been in the media somewhere every single day since November. And it really is a testament, I believe, to the fact that the powers that be inside of mainstream media see exactly what I'm laying out for you here, that the internal political pressures are growing to a point where they can no longer really be ignored. And so you have these reporters finally starting to give this massive attention over a sustained amount of time. And it's understandable how you see that play out politically as well. Because before all of this, if Congressman Chip Roy, said something what they would consider outrageous on the floor of Congress, they'd be, oh, that's just Chip. But now suddenly on Twitter or on the floor of the federal House of Representatives, when Chip Roy publicly questions the fact that Texans should be considering why we joined the union in the first place, it sort of has a lot more gravity than it would have before. So beyond the internal pressures, let's talk about what could take it all the way externally. Now, there is this video that we posted, I think it was about 2 years ago. It was from a podcast taping for Ted Cruz's podcast, where he was being interviewed in College Station, or he was doing his podcast recording in College Station, and he took a question from the audience about Texas leaving the Union. And in that video, he talked specifically, he said, look, I'm not a no, but I'm a not yet. He said, but here are my red lines. In fact, here's what he said.
If Texas were to secede, or any other state for that matter, what would do you think would be the best course of action, or how do you think the federal government would respond?
I think I know which side he's on. I don't know.
So look, I got to say, and it was kind of interesting. I was talking with Michael and Liz before the show, and they were asking, so is the question of Texas secession going to come up? And I said, yeah, probably. And listen, I understand the sentiment behind the question. I'm not there yet. And we actually had a debate over drinks last night after the show. Listen, I think Texas has a responsibility to the country. And I'm not ready to give up on America. I love this country. And I think without Texas, look, Texas, we're brash, we're not shy, we're sometimes larger than life, but Texas is right now an amazing force keeping America from going off the cliff, keeping America grounded on the values that built this country, on the values of freedom. I think we have a responsibility. Now, listen, if the Democrats end the filibuster, if they fundamentally destroy the country, if they pack the Supreme Court, if they make D.C. a state, if they federalize elections and massively expand voter fraud, there may come a point where it's hopeless. We're not there yet. And if there comes a point where it's hopeless, then I think we take NASA, we take the military, we take the oil.
Take me. Please take me. I don't want to be trapped.
What about Joe Rogan? Are you going to take him?
Joe Rogan, he might be the president of Texas.
So understand the gravity of this. You have a sitting United States senator who publicly established what his red lines were, his reasons that he would jump on the Texit bandwagon. And what are they? They are external pressures, things that are external to Texas. You know, the various issues that he talked about are all plausible, and they're all plausible because they are the official position of the Democratic Party, which is running the federal government. And I don't mean just in Congress or the presidency. I mean the 2.5 million unelected federal bureaucrats that never show up on a ballot, right? The civil service. Okay. So here are some things that could happen that would really push the Texan issue over the tipping point. And I think, and I throw these out there not to engage in what I refer to in the book as apocalypse pornography, but to really help you understand that these are some of the issues that are within the realm of possibility that could be external pressures that will push this thing all the way to Texas separating from the Union. And the first thing right out of the gate, and I think one of the most plausible scenarios, is some crushing defeat in the Supreme Court on Texas's effort to secure the border. If Texas is trying to secure the border, we know that it's happening. The border crisis is happening. It's being facilitated by the federal government. Texas is stepping up in the gap to try to address this. But if Texas were to face a crushing defeat in the Supreme Court on its border protection efforts, you would see the ranks of Texit swell overnight. Of the TNM, you would see Texit become the majority opinion in even those crappier surveys, polls that we talked about earlier, and the political pressure would mount on the elected officials, in particular Governor Greg Abbott, to put this thing to a vote and let's get Texas out of here. Without a doubt, the voices would become louder and stronger. And one thing we know about Governor Greg Abbott is if you apply enough political pressure to him, things can happen. Now, it just depends on whether or not it jives with his donors, but you get the point. So a crushing defeat in the Supreme Court, but more than that, something that seemed quite likely at the beginning of this year was the federal government using force to stop Texas' efforts to secure the border. Now, they have engaged in a campaign of harassment, right, which sort of led us to where we are right now, where they would cut the razor wire that Texas is deploying or lift it up with a forklift or, those are harassment techniques. They're really stupid. They're really ridiculous. But with Texas taking over the park in Eagle Pass, there was a lot of discussion about how the Biden administration would retaliate. And while their only retaliation has been to go be old man shaking fist at cloud in the courts, hoping the courts will rubber stamp their belief that Texas has no right to secure its own border. Basically, their only retaliation has been economic, where they made a swipe, effectively banning liquid natural gas exports, which is a major industry, particularly here in Southeast Texas. If anyone thinks that was not directed at Texas, you are sadly mistaken. If it wasn't, it was really bad timing, but it was obviously that. But there was rising concern that you would have the federal government sending in troops or sending in National Guard units, or even breaking the idea of posse comitatus and sending in the military, or federalizing the National Guard and ordering them to dismantle everything that Texas had done. So if you wanted to see this thing accelerate, like foot on the pedal down to the floor, the federal government using force to stop Texas from securing its border would be one of the things that you could look for. That would be an external pressure from the federal government that would be a terrible, terrible mistake. And I would suggest to you that would yet again increase that internal pressure, an external event or an external pressure, creating the internal pressure to force this issue as front and center, right? But additionally, looking down the road, if you were to see major anomalies in the 2024 presidential election, feet on the again, accelerator down to the floor. The fact of the matter is that legitimate concerns about the integrity of our electoral system have gone unanswered. In fact, those people who raise those issues are marginalized, demonized, go on and on and on. But if you see major anomalies in the 2024 presidential election, the calls for Texit will become overwhelming. And I believe the same thing happens if Joe Biden gets reelected as president of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that Texit is a partisan issue, but let's be honest, even Joe Biden is not popular with Democrats. I mean, he's just not. And people look at his age and his potential for dementia because he's showing some signs. They look at the economic policies. They look at the suspicions that he's not running anything. It's the people behind the scenes that are pulling the strings. Because, I mean, let's be honest, he was ruled too mentally unfit to stand trial, right? So if Joe Biden were to be reelected as president, you're going to see Republicans and Democrats here in Texas again call for Texit. It will be an overwhelming cry for it. And understand, I'm just going to get this out there now so that later we can soundbite this and remind people that I said it. It's not that it's a partisan issue. It is a bad governance issue. It is an administration that wants to expand the federal government and crush all of us under its boot heel. It's everything that comes with the election of Joe Biden. This is not a response to Joe Biden. It is just the long end of a train of abuses and usurpations, and people will view the reelection of Joe Biden through that lens, through the lens of what they've seen over the last 4 years. Which brings me to the next thing that could potentially do this, and that is the bursting of the federal debt bubble. As we're recording this, the federal debt stands at about $34 trillion. Estimates are it's growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. And, and we're seeing that as a function not just of the Biden administration, but also of the Republican-controlled Congress, allegedly, right? And so the bursting of the federal debt bubble, which would throw everything into chaos, this economic pressure would definitely drive the calls for Texas. Because if Texas drops in the rankings from the 8th largest economy in the world and drops down to 10, 11, 12, or whatever, the blame will go to the federal government. And where we stand now with the total debt and the upcoming liabilities, we're well over 100% of the GDP of all of the states in the union or the United States as a whole. So the bursting of the federal debt bubble is 100% within the realm of possibility. But another economic external pressure that you could see that could lead to a loud outcry for Texas would be a massive spike in inflation. We know right now that the only way that the federal government is keeping the economy propped up is by printing more and more and more money. And we say printing money, but I mean, now they don't even have to print. They don't even have to, use the cloth paper. They basically just go into the computers and make a ledger entry, and boom, there's more money in circulation. But if there were to be a massive spike, and I don't mean, look, we're all suffering with inflation, but if we start getting into hyperinflation territory, 100%, you will see the calls for Texas to withdraw from the union. And the good news is that we will have, by that time, probably a stable currency that we can implement in its place. Really and truly, if you want to see Texit happen very quickly, all it would take, and I say all it would take, this is really the next thing on the list, and that's one very public and gross display of federal overreach. And I'm not going to speculate what that could be, but if you saw a rogue agency do something very public and just 100% abusive, and that were to make the rounds, that could probably do it. But the other external pressure, and I don't know that it's entirely likely, but I do believe I will cover it on a future podcast. But any other state taking action to withdraw from the union ahead of Texas would definitely put the pedal to the metal here, because let's be honest, we want to be first. We won't be the only one, but we want to be first, right? I mean, we're Texas, right? And everybody expects us to be first. But if any other state decides they're going to take action, I would expect that people here in Texas would, again, there would be an outcry to get this thing done. There is in the minds of a lot of people, and we say it all the time, a rising tide raises all ships. And that is extremely true for self-determination. If you were to see a state make this move, it would increase support for independence across every other state, which is already, I mean, vast majority of states are already at sort of those tipping point percentages. So, but though any of those external pressures, any one of those could cause this thing to accelerate all the way to the finish line. And let's be honest, we're pretty close to the finish line anyway. All we have to do is just kind of go through the steps. But you see, when it comes to the Texit issue, it's not when the pros outweigh the cons. It's when the pros outweigh the pain of the cons. And right now, the people are clearly signaling that they're in pain. So when it comes to the question, how close is Texas to leaving the union? How close are we to bouncing out of here? I would tell you we're closer than pretty much anyone else thinks. And it's not that I'm telling you anything new. What I am telling you is here are the dots. Here is the picture that is being drawn. Number one, the support for it is there. Number two, structurally we're there, and where any gaps are between where Texas is and where it needs to be an independent nation, not to separate, because when you separate, you close those gaps immediately, or you work on closing those gaps. But I'm saying where we are now versus where we would be as a self-governing independent nation, the gaps are pretty tiny. And then finally, Texas is already seeing these internal pressures and the potential for these external pressures that are driving Texas to go the full distance, to go all the way to separate from the union. So I think you can go forth now and with confidence say, how close is Texas to leaving the union? We're pretty much there. Okay. All right. Well, that's a wrap for the Texas News Podcast. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to encourage you, wherever you watch or listen to this podcast, to do all the cool things, like, subscribe, comment, do all the things, leave us reviews, just do all the things to help spread the word about all we're talking about here, all of these things that are happening with Texas and Texas independence. I'd like to remind you if you want to help support this podcast, head over right now and become a member of the TNM. Head over to tnm.me/join. and become a member today. That helps us keep this podcast on the air and all of our communication efforts. And frankly, growing from that 620,000, that 1.2 million registered supporters, definitely your membership helps. And so with that, I will leave you with the words I leave you with every time we're together. They're the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?